Oh, hello. I didn't see you there. I can't pinpoint the moment that I stopped wondering what Jon Stewart was thinking about the world. For nearly a decade, it was something I cared deeply about. I've mentioned before that his tenure on The Daily Show was part of my morning routine from high school through college and on until the bitter end. At the time, it seemed like the worst possible moment to leave. An overgrown child had just announced his run for the White House, and what would I do without my daily dose of his eviscerations of bad politicians or incompetent news people? And more to the point, how could we have the 2016 election without him? But the truth was that in those last few months, you could see that it was time. The energy that made him such a valuable part of the capital D discourse was gone, and he had already reshaped the landscape in his image, not just in terms of how the news was being discussed, but literally who was doing those discussions. Stephen Colbert had dropped his character and was taking over The Late Show. John Oliver's Last Week Tonight was already a hit. Larry Wilmore's Gone Too Soon, The Nightly Show, was doing its thing, and Samantha Bee was gearing up for Full Frontal. Heck, Michael Che had done a few bits on The Daily Show that ended up getting him that spot on SNL's Weekend Update. Plus, it's not like The Daily Show actually went away. Came back a few months later with Trevor Noah in the seat, and he was a breath of fresh air from the word go. Jon Stewart's legacy was secure. So he went off to his farm and faded from view and then eventually from mind. He'd occasionally pop up to talk to Colbert or to chastise the US Senate for refusing to take care of 9/11 first responders. But the world had kind of moved on. And if I wasn't sure of that before, I certainly am now. Hello, everyone, anyone, and welcome to the Week I Review. You can call me hardly strategic. And today, I'm talking about Irresistible. Perhaps that was needlessly flip, but the more I wrote and rewrote this introduction, the more convinced I became that Jon Stewart is a man stuck in time. But it's really, I don't think it's him so much as the world that he made himself a part of. For years, I watched multiple political commentary shows daily, listened to a half dozen political podcasts weekly. But as this particular presidency has worn on, it's become harder and harder for me to meaningfully engage in it. I didn't sever that completely, but let's be real. No random guy needs to understand as much about the American political system as I did. And it's becoming increasingly clear to me that the knowledge I developed during that time is still good, because as much as the rot has been exposed in our system these past few years, people like Jon Stewart were calling it out long before, and nothing has changed. He made a name for himself by scrutinizing the symbiotic, but more like mutually parasitic, relationship between political media and elections. It's a simple but vicious cycle. 24-hour news requires constant points of discussion and coverage. But there isn't that much that's important to discuss, so newsworthiness is assigned basically at random. But every choice made feeds back into the endless campaign, because there's always a comment from one person to be made, which then requires the comment from another, or no comment from either, which inevitably results in comment from a third, and etc., etc. At the end of it all, some people are extremely rich, and everyone is a little bit dumber. While working on this review, I checked out multiple interviews that Stewart had done promoting the film, and it was almost nostalgic to hear him talk about Fox News and what an anti-Fox would actually look like. Yes, it's still true, but it's not new. So too with Irresistible. Here is a film about this mutually parasitic relationship, and it is a real and bad aspect of our society, one that is directly relevant to 2020 in that we have arguably the second most consequential election in modern history coming up fairly soon. The first most was 2016, and we fucked that one right up. But it's hard to fathom where things will be in 4 weeks, let alone 4 months. And so the film has entered into a world that is preoccupied with more pressing things. That is not Jon Stewart's fault. But it's his fault that he made a movie about what he said on Pod Save America was the least of the electoral system's corrosive effects, which is all the money flowing into it. The downstream impact all of that money has on governance is the real concern. But he didn't make a movie about the downstream impact, he just made a movie about the money. Chris Cooper plays Colonel Jack Hastings, an ex-Marine and current farmer who gives a rousing speech during a town hall in the fictional town of Deerlachen in what I can only assume is the fictional state of Wisconsin. The big bad mayor wants to enforce ID checks, and the colonel stands up for the undocumented. He wants to know what happened to everyone's compassion. And when the mayor objects, he says, "You're not a bad person, Billy. You're just scared. Hell, we all are." Someone records the speech, puts it on YouTube, where it is brought to the attention of Gary Zimmer, played by Daily Show alum Steve Carell, a Democratic political consultant reeling from the 2016 election. This video feels like the answer to all of his problems, like they've just fallen into his lap. I mean, you remember the news articles from that time, the diner journalism where columnists would go and talk to people who don't matter, who voted for a man whose incompetence and narcissism has resulted in the unnecessary deaths of many, many thousands of Americans, and then use their bad worldview as clickbait to shame the elites into forgetting that actually the president lost the popular vote by multiple percentage points. Gosh, I hated those. But I'm sure Gary loved them. He's excited to liberate the heartland of real America, which is where the location card tells us that Deerlachen is. So he hops onto his private jet and heads on over to recruit Jack for a mayoral run. A new type of Democrat who believes that bad things like religion and the military are good, actually. But first, he has to ingratiate himself with the locals, which he does in typical millionaire douchebag fashion. He walks into a local bar and asks for a burger and a bud because he thinks that's folksy. The place doesn't sell either of those, but they don't even bother to tell him that. They just have someone slip out the side and pick them up for him. He's DC Gary now, and everyone in the town will know his name by the morning. Jack agrees to run under the condition that Gary stays in Deerlachen for the duration to actually manage the whole thing. Gary agrees and proceeds to make a mountain out of an anthill. This race is meant to ring a bell heard across the nation. If a Democrat can win here, they can win anywhere and everywhere. And Gary will be there to make wild amounts of money overseeing it all. His presence brings his conservative counterpart Rose Byrne as Faith Brewster to the town. And it's on. They hire teams of data analysts and pollsters, talk about it on the national news, have fancy fundraisers in New York City, and set up super PACs to take and then spend all of the money. And that's fine, I guess. I don't know. It makes sense as a Jon Stewart production in a way that his feature debut, Rosewater, never quite did. That film was a fairly serious depiction of journalist Maziar Bahari's 2009 imprisonment by the Iranian government. And while Stewart had a personal stake in that story, it felt a little odd coming from him. But people cross genre bounds all the time, and I don't like to pigeonhole people. The bigger issue is that I could not tell you a single thing about Rosewater other than that I saw it at release and reviewed it for Flixus.com. But even reading said review failed to jog my memory. Some of that is definitely a result of it being a poorly constructed review that I am at least marginally ashamed of having publicly available under my byline. But when I go back through my archives, seeing the titles is usually enough to bring back something. Not so with Rosewater. And Irresistible will be the same. I can already feel it slipping from my mind, and although I laughed out loud multiple times, the only reason I remember why is because I took notes. Like the scene where Natasha Lyonne's data analyst sends a pamphlet about the colonel's liberal stance on birth control to a neighborhood that has an abnormally high concentration of single women with strong interest in reproductive rights, only to learn that her anonymized data missed the fact that they were a bunch of nuns in a convent, is very funny. In context with all of the variably meaningful apologies that have been coming out recently in the media and on YouTube, I found a lot to like in the scene where Gary shouts about needing more Hispanics in the campaign office, realizes what he just did, and then immediately pivots into a speech about how sorry he is, how his words and actions don't reflect who he is as a person, and how this should be seen as a teachable moment. But much more time is devoted to far less incisive commentary. For example, did you know that super PACs are bad? When Gary grabs a random group of Deerlockeners and tells them that they're now a super PAC and cannot officially coordinate with the campaign, and so they have to go sit in another part of the room, I guess that's funny. But also the awful Supreme Court decisions that allowed for super PACs to form turned 10 this year, and that particular joke has been made dozens, if not hundreds of times. So who is that written for? Better yet, who is all of this written for? There's a fucking Joe the Plumber reference in there, and I literally said out loud, okay, boomer. But to give the film credit where it's due, its big twist does reveal the extent to which super PACs are unaccountable for their spending in a way that I'd never heard or seen before. Hell, the end credits feature an interview with Trevor Potter, a former chairman of the Federal Election Commission, who confirms that from a pure legal perspective, everything depicted here is by the books. On the one hand, I think it was fun to have the residents of Deerlocken pull one over on the political elites, faking the whole damn thing as a way to get money from the mega rich into the coffers of super PACs officially run by Deerlockeners, who can then just give that money straight to the town itself, staving off the financial ruin that they were headed for, and actually allowing them to expand their infrastructure for the first time in years. On the other hand, the movie had to lie to us to get there, and I don't appreciate being lied to. During the reveal, we see the takes where the colonel kept flubbing the lines of that viral speech that his daughter, Diana, wrote for him. But at the beginning of the film, we didn't just see the YouTube footage. We were in the room with all of them, and we learn here that we were shown a version of the events that never actually happened. As a viewer, this is objectively frustrating and makes the victory ring a little hollow. Lie to the political consultants, they're a bunch of hacks anyway, but don't lie to me. I think we can safely say at this point that Jon Stewart is an unremarkable filmmaker. His movies aren't bad or even boring, they're just nothing. I have already forgotten much of what happens in Irresistible, and that's while I've been racking my brain trying to remember. By the time my next video goes live, it will be completely gone. 5.9 out of 10. Thank you so much for watching, and thank you particularly to my patrons, my mom, Hamry and Marco, Kat Saracata, Benjamin Schiff, Anthony Cole, @BlazienFMA, Magnolia Denton, Elliot Fowler, and Greg Lucina. If you like this video, that's great. If not, I'm sorry. If you want to see more, please subscribe. I hope to see you next week.